My name is Eleanor Hannan. I teach sometimes at the Shadbolt Centre of the Arts. I've taught here for many years, since the 90s. I'm a visual artist, and in the last 15 years of my visual art career, I have worked in textiles. So what I wanted to show you here is how I have kind of translated my visual artwork into textile work and how I combine the two. I've taught the last 20 years or so in the fashion design departments around the Lower Mainland. And I teach surface design, so I actually teach dyeing and printing. And I'm teaching it to fashion students, so I am teaching the preparation of textiles and cloth. And as I would see my students prepare these large, beautiful pieces of textile using dyes and using print, I began to see how I could actually incorporate that into my own artwork, adapting as I go. So I want to kind of show you my chunky, in a way, kind of chunky way of adapting textile techniques to essentially what is a painting. All of you who paint out there, you'll recognize it as a way a painter works, even though I'm working in textiles. I wanted to show you that everything starts white. So I was going to show you here that the fabric is first of all dyed. So let me show you here that process, very simple process of the dye application to the fabric. So if we look over here at the scene, at the tightrope scene, all of the pieces of fabric here have been dyed with a cold water dye that you can use by hand. So I've got the dye powder right here. So it starts off as a powder. I turn it into a liquid. I'm working, of course, with gloves on because it's a fabric dye, so it will dye my skin because I'm a protein, so it'll dye my skin. So I want to make sure that I'm actually working with plastic sheeting under my fabric, gloves on, and I'm just applying the dye to the fabric. So I'm taking my sponge. You could use any kind of anyone painting out there, and the students in the Shadbolt Centre who have done my dye class, they just love the creative way that dyes can be applied to the fabric. So I tend to use something that will give me maximum variation. So here, everybody, I'm not dyeing for evenness. I'm not trying to get an even piece of cloth. I'm actually trying to get something that will be uneven. We kind of have a natural appearance to it. So once my white cloth has got its initial color on it, it's going to have its initial color on it. I'll just close that up so we're safe here as we continue. I'm going to take the cloth, and the cloth is wrapped for 48 hours in plastic sheeting. So I'm just going to wrap that in plastic sheeting. And I will set that aside. So that's done in order to allow the dye to set onto the cloth. Now, you know, everybody, if you're painting, you don't have to do this. As soon as you finish painting, the paint is dry, or a few days later it's dry. But for anyone working in textiles, and again, any of my dye students from Shadbolt will recognize that, the fabric is wrapped for 48 hours in plastic to keep it moist, and that will allow my dye to become permanent on the fiber. So here's a piece that's been pre-dyed. This has now gone through, after I unwrap it 2 days later, it's gone through a thorough rinsing and even a machine washing. And now what I have is a red piece of cloth. So this dye is not going to shift or move. When I sell my pieces, I ensure people that the dyes are going nowhere. In fact, they're as permanent. I won't say they're more permanent than paint, but they're certainly as permanent as any painted surface. So I'm just going to remove my gloves now because my fabric is safely dyed. And what I want to show you now is that the next step for me, often I actually will use the dyed cloth just as is, so just using the red cloth as is, but I'll often next silk screen the fabric. So I have here, everybody, a silk screen. So this is a screen print. So this screen print is grass, is a grass texture. It's taken from my own photographs. So all of my own silk screens are, again, my own photographs. So I'm doing everything from my own sources. So this was just a grass texture that happened to actually just work very well with the idea of landscape. So I'm just going to show you that process of now silk screening my dyed fabrics. some nice red dyed fabric. I'm working, by the way, here on a padded board, and I will just tape my beautiful piece of fabric down to the padded board. I always give it a quick little iron so that it's nice and flat. And then I'm going to lay my screen, silk screen down on it. So I'm going to have this beautiful grass texture taken from my photograph of grass. I'm using a pigment. This is, everybody, a fabric pigment. It's a very beautiful, expensive fabric pigment we get to use here at the Shadbolt Center. So you're taking classes, you get to come and learn about the beautiful fabric pigment. This color, actually, that I'm using here, everybody, it's a beautiful color, but honestly, we made this color by mixing all the excess student color together. So it's a kind of a mushy green color, but it's very, very lovely. So what I'm going to do is take my textile squeegee. So these are squeegees made especially for textile printing. And I'm going to pull that image down onto my piece of textile. And then just setting that aside. And I'm lifting that off of my piece of textile. So I've just got, just to show you there, I've got that little print reproduced now on my piece of textile. So this one, this particular green that I've used from the kind of jar of all kind of student color is, has a very high contrast around the red or with the red. This piece then, everybody, like a paint, it needs a little bit of time to dry. So I'm just going to stick it over here while it dries, and we can show that to you later. I'm just showing you here pieces that have been already silk screened with the grass imagery. So I've got a piece of green cloth here. I've screened it with my grass imagery. This is now dried. Once the pigment has dried on the dyed textile, I would now give it a really good iron. So it's ironed in order to set the pigment on the textile. So in terms of referring to this piece here, what I would do then is, once I've got my background, actually in this piece, it was just a piece of white twill, which is a twill cloth. It's often a background cloth. It's like canvas. It was dyed this green. And then pieces start to be composed onto the cloth as if I were striking with paint, as if I were just sort of working with paint on the cloth. So I might take some elements here and just start to place them. Here's a little figurative piece that would go on here. And then conveniently, I use this little piece of backing. It's an applique paper called an applique paper. And the applique paper is just applied to the cloth. It is pulled away, and then the piece of cloth can be stuck down to the textile while you build your composition. I can also lift it with this nice little applique paper and move it around if I want to change positions. So I can play with these textile pieces the way I would play as a painter. Once I'm really happy with my composition, I'm going to take my steam iron and I'm just going to press everything down onto my cloth. So I didn't put some of these pieces down. I just put this one down. So you see that that is now permanent on the cloth. Here's another piece that I just created, a simple little piece. You can see it's fun to just make these simple little compositional pieces, and it's done with adhering this grass printed red cloth onto the little bit more elaborate green and black cloth. Once that is done, though, everybody, once I've got all that set, I now go into the piece of work and I begin to stitch it down. So I use sometimes the sewing machine and sometimes I work by hand. And I often also add in a little bit additional fabric paint where I need a little bit of maybe tonal area or a little bit more stain or color. And in this particular work, what I did is I made this whole skirt area separately so it has Velcro on the back so I can take it off and put a different item on there if I wanted to. So in textile work, you can play with stuff in a way you don't necessarily play with painting. And I also just wanted to show you here as well that when I started to work on this piece, it was for this show, the famous knitting and stitching show in London. I really wanted to know how this was going to work. So I made a series about 6 or 8 studies. So these are my little studies. So fun to do. They're very weird looking because I was kind of playing around with how this figure should traverse the landscape, but it gave me such a solid idea of where I wanted the spacing of the composition to go. So the spacing is quite exact in both of them. And of course here I was really experimenting with very, very millions of different kinds of colors of both dye and print and different kinds of cloth, and then beginning to put it all together with the stitching. So this is a portrait of my dad, and one side is a hand embroidery, so the piece is done stitching by hand. So, you know, I learned to stitch by hand, hand embroidery actually from very, very young. I did the embroidery of my dad from a photograph. This is more similar to the photograph where my dad was standing on a very windy beach, and he's got this quite almost a romantic air about him. But I wanted to just show here that I did the hand embroidery. It's just black embroidery floss on canvas. So it's just on raw painter's canvas, but not primed. And this is a lovely, lovely surface actually also to stitch on, everybody. So, you know, often I'll encourage my students to start with painting, but stitch into it afterwards because you get a raised surface texture on it. Sometimes a bit hard to see unless you're standing up close to it. But so his background is in the, there's white on white stitching to form the background. And then this piece is a portrait of my friend who's also an embroiderer. And this piece is entirely 100% done on the sewing machine. So it's a complete embroidery. So we call this technique in the world of textile art out there, we call it free motion embroidery, which means that when you're working on the machine, it's not the feed dogs are lifted on the sewing machine, or the thing that holds the fabric down is lifted so that you can move the sewing machine like a drawer would. So what I did with this one is I did a million sketches, sketch after sketch after sketch, and many, many studies for the portrait in order to be able to get it. So lots of studies the way I did with this one here. And then I just sat down with it. I had the photograph in front of me, and I just was working on the sewing machine. It's very big, so I had to shove it into the sewing machine. And then so I have to keep taking it out of the sewing machine, putting it up on the wall and going, hey, does this work? As we all know as painters, you know, you put your painting up and go, oh, shoot, that didn't quite work. But as you can see, I covered it with textures, so any little flubs got integrated. I am happy to have shown some of my working process here as a visual artist. I really would like to express my gratitude to the City of Burnaby for setting up this project for artists to have the opportunity to show what they are doing just in the privacy of their own studio. It's exciting to be able to have the images in the park and for people to be able to scan and be able to see right into the way the artist is working. It's something, that little keyhole into what often gets locked away in a studio is a very, very exciting moment. So I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to be able to come and even put this together, to spend the time even thinking about this as a visual artist in my studio and how to put this together to best illustrate what I do and what I would like to share in future with Shadbolt, the Shadbolt community. That desire to bring the textile arts forward at the Shadbolt Center as an art form, and to just share my love of working, my love of visual art working, and having had the opportunity to share it through the City of Burnaby in this way has been an extraordinary experience. I'm very grateful. It's often asked whether this is really a female art form, and I think for me, I'm bringing in my own masculine side to it, that power, that strength that I had in my own drawing and on my own visual work. But I know now that actually the idea of incorporating the quality of the sewing machine is being incorporated into the visual arts in all work, in all people's work. It now becomes almost, you see them hanging around in fine arts schools these days, sewing machines just hanging around in the corner. And because they do make a particular kind of mark, and of course the artist, any visual artist, anyone working in the arts is interested in the mark, in what mark things make. And the sewing machine happens to make a very, very beautiful mark. The iron is unbelievably useful in the studio as well. So I think it is not just seen as a female art form in any way. It is seen with the power to express anything that needs to be expressed.